Hi, everyone. Welcome to your lecture. This is part one. We are jumping right into talking about adolescence and puberty. Before we start talking about what puberty is all about biologically and socially, I just want to give you a moment to reflect on your own experience. So, if you wouldn't mind, just take a minute to think of a word, just one word that describes your experience with puberty and adolescence. And so, for most of us, we came up with something like uncomfortable or tough or perhaps confusing or overwhelming, but maybe you had a different experience. Maybe it was exciting or maybe even beautiful, right? Well, and there's a lot of reasons why you might have a different experience, and we're going to jump into that right now. So, when we think about puberty, there's three different perspectives on how we can kind of wrap our minds around it and understand it. The first one is a biological perspective, the reality that your body is going through a lot of rapid changes very quickly and hormonally that are causing unpredictable behavior and moods. The second is a social perspective. The reality is that how we view puberty has a large impact on how we experience it. And we found this to be true with Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist who actually studied Samoa culture. And she found that during adolescence for that culture, it was a very exciting and beautiful time. So there is a piece of social perspective that really does impact how we experiencing these things. Now, the third perspective is a balanced approach where you combine the psychological, social influences, and the biology. And what we find is that we really have three very distinct stages that we move through in our culture. The first being early adolescence, where we recognize lots of biological things are happening in our body and a lot of rapid change is occurring. And then what happens from 14 to 16 as we move into this mid adolescence years where we have less changes happening. We're almost done with that. And then around 16 to 18, most of the puberty changes have been done, and we're really starting to take on more of an adult perspective and adult roles. We're moving more into adulthood. All right, so that's maybe some differences of why you thought of a word that was different. Now, these are some basic things to know about puberty. It begins actually around 6 to 8. We like to think of it happening when adolescence, but really, hormonal changes and the signals we're sending to our body occur much earlier than that. By the time we reach age 10, it has already increased tenfold. That's a significant increase. We also know that around the age of 10, some children will already be experiencing some sexual attraction. Now, when we think about puberty, we can really break it down into two parts. We can break it down into growth and maturation of sexual characteristics. Okay, so let's take a look at each. The first we want to look at is breaking it down by sex, right? So it's different for each of us depending on if we are a girl or a boy. So if your biological sex is a girl, you're going to have a lot of puberty changes based on these types of hormones being released into your body. Okay, so your ovaries are going to release estrogen, and that's going to cause your height to grow. You're going to have more accumulation of fat because of it. Your menstruation is also caused because of the estrogen in your body. You're also going to have more maturing of your reproductive organs, and your bone density is going to increase, all because of estrogen. Now, we also have androgens as girls, and that's going to give us our height. It contributes to height. It also contributes to our underarm hair and our pubic hair. And then we have our growth hormone, which comes directly from our pituitary gland, and that helps with our growth spurt. And the last one comes from our thyroid with its thyroxine, and that again helps with our growth spurt and maturing of our skeletal parts. Okay? Now, if we compare that to boys, it's not all that different. The one column that changes really is that left column, and that's because they don't have ovaries, right? They have testes. And the difference is going to be that they're going to have large amounts of testosterone, but they still have a small amount of estrogen. Okay, so we see muscle growth, body and facial hair, height, bone density, broadening of the shoulders happening because of the testosterone. And the other columns, for the most part, really remain the same. So we're, again, only that last column really shifts. Let's talk about body growth and the difference between boys and girls. So at the age of 10, when puberty kind of starts, girls are typically starting their growth spurt first, and they're going to be taller than boys. And I apologize for these stereotypical representations of boy and girl. I wanted you to have a visual, and unfortunately, there's no way to get around being stereotypical in a visual without being stereotypical. All right, so moving forward, sorry about that. Age 10, the girls are ahead, and then about 12 and a half, boys hit their growth spurt. And then you see this evening out, right? And then around 13 and a half, boys are going to start passing up girls. And this is going to continue at age 16. Growth in the body size is complete for girls, but boys are still continuing to grow. And then at age 17, the growth is complete for both, and boys are typically taller than girls. All right, moving forward, let's talk more about the differences we see in each sex. For males, we see a broadening of shoulders, right? We talked about that before, but for females, we have a broadening of hips. We also have a difference in density in our bodies in the sense that males tend to put on more muscle mass, 150% greater, and females tend to put on more fat, especially in our legs, our arms, and our trunk. We also see that they get larger skeletal muscles, heart, and lungs for males, and there's a significant increase in endurance, strength, and speed. Whereas with girls, we kind of level off at the age of 14, and the development for gross motor tends to be a little bit more slow and gradual. All right, let's talk about sexual maturation. When we think about sexual maturation, there are two things or two components we can think about. The first is primary sexual characteristics, and these are things that are directly involved with our reproductive organs. They're things that we typically don't really think about seeing. Our ovaries, our uterus, the vagina. For boys, it's the penis, the scrotum, and the testes. The secondary sexual characteristics are visible on the outside, and they serve as additional information regarding where we kind of stand in our maturation process. This could be things like body hair, things of that nature. Okay. There are differences in how we go through our sexual maturation process as well. Menarche is the start of our first menstrual cycle. This typically happens around the average age of 12 and a half in North America. It's later in the process of puberty. It's after that peak in for girls in their height spurt. Not always with the release of an egg. That typically doesn't happen until 12 to 18 months later. For boys, we see a deepening in the voice from growth in the larynx and vocal cords lengthening. We see enlargement in the penis and the testes, facial and body hair, and spermarchy, which is the first ejaculation around 13 and a half years old. There's a lot of differences in when and how we go through puberty. The first is biology. We know that identical twins are going to be more similar than fraternal twins. We also know nutrition and exercise have a large impact on puberty. We know that diets higher in fat have fat cells that release a protein called leptin, which is thought to trigger the brain to go through puberty a little bit quicker. We also know that when you're malnourished or you are an intense exercise or intense athlete, you're less likely to have your menses early. Socioeconomic status is also something that is impactful with puberty, in the sense that if you are lower socioeconomic status, you're more likely to eat a lot more processed foods, which means you might go through puberty sooner. Ethnicity also matters. We see that African American girls tend to begin puberty about a year earlier than their European American counterparts. They also menstruate about 6 months before their European American counterparts. Geographical region is going to matter also, because when we think about poorer areas, they're going to have higher infectious disease. There's going to be a greater increase in malnourishment. And because of those things, it's going to impact when puberty begins, and it's going to delay it. And the last piece I want to talk to you about is the secular trend. And this is the overall idea that over time, these things are happening sooner and sooner, earlier and earlier. We just see a trend happening in general. Okay, moving on to brain development really quickly. Talking about brain development, we see a lot of things happening for us right now. So the first piece I want to talk about is that there's additional connections happening between the two cerebral hemispheres, the corpus callosum and the prefrontal cortex. And because of these additional connections, we're seeing a lot more flexible thinking, a lot more adaptable thinking happening. So that's really great to see. Another thing, however, that happens though is that we see the prefrontal cortex still really needing some additional growth. It's not exactly where it's going to land just yet. It continues to grow until the age of 25. And because it's not fully developed, we still see a lot of impulsive act, a lot of irrational thoughts sometimes, also an inability to plan or, delay gratification. All of those things are eventually going to be controlled by a developed prefrontal cortex. But again, as an adolescent, it's not completely developed yet. And the last piece I want to talk to you about is the ventral striatum. And what is interesting about this time period for the ventral striatum is that this piece processes motivation and reward, but for adolescents, they experience things much more intensely. So stress is more intense as well as pleasure. So we could see how experiencing things at a more intense level might impact our actions. All right. And with that, we're going to take a break here. We're going to come back and talk about psychological impacts. I'll see you then.